Welcome to Holy Post episode 457. On this week's show, I'm out of town, so Phil has a conversation with Kaitlyn Schiess and guest host Mike Erre about all the problems plaguing evangelicalism. Are they just a bug or an actual feature? And what should we do with everyone deconstructing their faith these days? Is it actually possible to abandon evangelicalism but still love evangelicals? Then I come back for an interview with Beth Allison Barr, the historian from Baylor University, about her new book, The Making of Biblical Womanhood, How the Subjugation of Women Became Gospel Truth. We'll examine patriarchy within the church, the history of that trend, and why it may not be as rooted in the New Testament as you thought. All of that, plus Phil regales us with an entirely new edition of News of the Butt. But first, today's episode is being brought to you by our other podcast, The Movie Proposal. If you are a fan of pop culture and you like looking at films through the lens of Christianity, then you shouldn't miss The Movie Proposal, which I co-host with my friend Josh Lindsay. Each episode looks at movies through the lens of matrimony. We look at something old, something new, something borrowed, and something blue. That means a movie that blew our minds or which really blew chunks. And we offer our proposals about a new film and how we should understand and interpret it. It's a lot of fun. Go check it out wherever you get your podcasts or go to holypost.com to learn more. Okay, on with today's show.
Hey there, welcome back to the podcast. This is the Holy Post Podcast, and I'm Phil Vischer, and I am here with Kaitlyn Schiess. Hi, Kaitlyn.
Hi, Phil.
And I'm also here. Wait, that's not Skye. You're not Skye. I'm here with Mike Erre. Mike.
Same hairline.
Same hairline.
Same skin tone.
No, not.
Same body type?
No, it's falling apart, Mike. It's falling apart.
Oh.
Mike Erre is the host of the Vox podcast, soon to have a new name, which I know, but I can't reveal.
That's right. On penalty of death. On death.
Yeah, and he's here because, why is he here? Well, let me tell you why he's here, because Skye is out of town all week, and I'm out of
You
town.
told me I was here because you needed a new co-host.
Today.
I didn't what?
I need
this
a new
is
co-host.
Temporary gig?
Today. I'm out of town all week next week, and there's no overlap for Skye and I to record.
You said it was going to be renamed The Holy Most with Mike Erre and Phil Vischer and Kaitlyn. That's what you said.
Did I say that? Is that maybe I've forgotten things I've said. Okay, here's the theme song. What's the news that you like the most? Who's your favorite podcast host? If it's breakfast, get your toast. It's Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. And sometimes Christian. Okay, we've had Mike on the show multiple times, but only as an interviewee.
That's right. This is a whole new level.
As a co-host. So this is a whole new level. It's very exciting. We don't know how it's going to go. Kaitlyn,
kind
of course.
Summer intern.
Yeah, Mike's our summer intern. Mike, coffee, please.
Yes.
and then get back on the show. Kaitlyn is a regular co-host, regular third seater, making her, 10th appearance or something like that. So she can show Mike how it's done, okay? How you do it well.
Try.
Okay, good. Now there's something that we have serious stuff to talk about, but I can't just start with serious stuff. I can't.
Can't do it.
I just can't. So, and Mike has never had the privilege of being a part of one of these conversations. So it's time for News of the Butt. And now it's time for News of the Butt.
Oh, I have only dreamt of being a part of these conversations.
Haven't you?
Now it's time. I was hoping.
Oh, he was hoping. He was so hoping. Okay, I have to talk about a worm. I just have to tell you, first of all, you know why I do this, Mike? Do you know why?
No.
Do you think, because some people might think you just do this because you enjoy it. You just enjoy it, Phil, and that's why you do it. That's not why I do it.
No,
Do you know why I do
Phil.
it? I do it because the people demand it. And do you know how I know they demand it? Mike, do you know how I know?
I don't know.
Because every week someone sends me another News of the Butt story. At least once or twice a week.
Is it the same person?
No. No.
Is it, so you're saying it's different people?
Hundreds of people, maybe thousands. Look, they spend their free time scouring the internets for News of the Butt potential
Kaitlyn's
stories.
face. expresses what my heart feels, which is utter skepticism.
Yeah.
Kaitlyn, the living emoji, is telling us how we should all feel about this.
Skeptical.
Okay, I got to talk about, but I don't know how long it's been since I found a news of the butt story, because
Involving a worm.
I don't have to anymore. So this is one that someone sent me 2 weeks ago. So I put it in my pocket. I have about 10 more in my pocket. There's a worm that lives inside sea sponges. You know what a sea sponge is? Lots of holes, lots of places that a worm could hide. What's unique about this worm, though, because I know that's what you're asking, Mike. What's unique about this worm? I can picture lots of worms in sea sponges.
Totally.
As it grows, it branches. It branches in different directions inside the sea sponge. They have found these worms with as many as 500 different branches inside a sponge. And get this, the worm has one mouth, but every branch has a butt.
No, thank you.
That was the best. Kaitlyn's face on that.
Yeah.
One mouth, 500 butts.
Yeah.
Is that amazing? Is that like, God, what a wonder your creation is? Now, here's where it gets
surprising he didn't list that in Job as one of the things that he was super proud of.
Where were you when I created the 500
when I created
worm?
500 butts of one organism.
The weird thing is, and this is what's confusing scientists, there's no way for the one tiny mouth to eat enough food to fuel the entire organism and to give a reason for existence to 500 different butts. So they're not sure what they're for, because they've dissected numerous specimens and have never found contents in their digestive tracts. So they're wondering if they actually absorb nutrients out of the water through these little hairs on their bodies, and they don't use their butts at all.
Phil,
can you
I have
imagine having 500 underutilized butts, Mike?
Phil, I have a question. Do we have butt confirmation on this? I mean, do we for a fact know that these are not alternative mouths?
Oh.
I mean, I'm just saying, if there's no, I mean, how do we know these are all butts if there's nothing coming out?
Yeah, I remember being asked that question at a doctor's appointment.
You know, Phil, I just turned 50, so I'm learning all about this.
Yes, congratulations. These are all good questions, Mike. Kaitlyn, stay with us, Kaitlyn.
This just sounds like a 5-year-old boy or a dad thought up a new animal, and this is what they made.
Yes, yeah. The 500-butted worm. Oh, this has been the news of the butt.
This has been the news of the butt.
Okay. See, that wasn't that bad.
That was better.
Sometimes people send me butt news suggestions that are too gross, and I just think, no, that's gross. I don't like that. So
I am shocked that there's a line.
There is a line.
I'm shocked. I'm shocked that you censor anything.
A few weeks ago, we did a story about Godzilla versus King Kong, who would poop the biggest. And it was a story, and they actually asked scientists, tell us about great apes versus large reptiles, who would poop the biggest. And that one was really close to getting the axe, because it was a little gross. But most of them are, the guy got trapped in the porta potty because a tree fell on Gettysburg National Battlefield, and he was in a porta potty, and it fell on the porta potty, and the police had to come and cut him out. They had to cut him out of the porta potty. That's a little.
That was a pretty good one.
Yeah, that was a good one.
I think being in a row of porta potties during a tornado would be up there too.
Ooh, yeah.
Just that thing gets swishing around, and who knows?
Yeah, that's just so Dorothy. That's kind of fun. And where do you land if you get carried up in a porta potty?
Yep.
But if getting caught up in a house takes you to Oz, where does getting caught up in a porta potty take you?
Exactly.
Think about that, Mike.
Exactly.
I don't want to think about that.
Kaitlyn, it looks like you're not enjoying this as much as you should.
This is not how I expected my first post-seminary graduation week to go, to be hearing these questions.
Okay. Here's what I really
Yeah,
want to talk about.
congratulations, scholar
Oh
athlete.
yeah. She
Thank you,
graduated.
Mike.
She graduated from seminary. She won the best systematic theology, even though she's a girl, award. Is that what it
What?
says on the trophy?
No, it does not
First of
say
all,
that.
what?
She won the best systematic theology award at DTS. Mike,
I mean, I read her book. It's pretty freaking awesome. So
I don't
No,
think it was.
thanks.
I don't think that's why they gave it to her. It was not because of your
No.
book.
Nope.
Was it?
Nope.
No,
Nope.
it was because of your grades. Or did you do like a big diorama of systematic theology in the
did you draw a symbol-filled chart of the last times and times?
That would
Did you
be
do
very
that? With
DTS.
bowls and
That would be very
swirls?
DTS.
Would that ever be DTS?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, I did not do that.
Okay. So I got to talk about some stuff. The word deconstruction is coming up a lot. It's
Mhm.
just coming up. Everyone is deconstructing. He deconstructed his way right out of the faith. He's gone. Mike, you've been talking on your podcast. You brought up deconstruction numerous times, and at one point you put a spin on it that the kind of deconstruction that's healthy isn't a better word for it. Discipleship. And I thought that was interesting. And so I wanted to talk about that. And I wanted to talk about things we've been watching happening over the last couple of weeks that, within the evangelical world, within evangelicalism, that are a little disturbing. And where it's like, oh, that seriously needs to be deconstructed. That's something, that's a brick that someone needs to just throw out of this house. So, the story of Josh Duggar has been in the news. Josh Duggar, one of the 2,700 Duggars in that quiverful, was arrested for child pornography. Looks like he's going to jail. It was pretty bad. And whether or not that's the story, that what a lot of people have focused more on is his behavior has been known for a while. All of the efforts to get him help were very confined within a particular section of evangelicalism. And even now, he's out on bail. He can't live with his siblings, so he's going to live with a couple where the wife does not want him there. She teaches piano lessons to children. She doesn't want him in the house, but her husband said that was what they're going to do. And she said, it's not my place to question my husband. So we're kind of seeing this, like this kind of toxic masculinity or the protecting of men who do very, very bad things because, we don't want to ruin his life. And then we got to Mother's Day, and on Mother's Day, Al Mohler tweeted, Al Mohler, the president of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary.
Great day for this too. Great job, Al.
Yes, yeah. Tweeted a quote from I forget the guy. He's a 19th century theologian who was
John Bozeman.
Yeah. I thought I picked it up, but it's not here. So a theologian, just talking about how women were never supposed to preach. Ever, ever, ever in mixed company. Never, ever, ever. And this is from a guy who was a slave owner. So, first of all, you say, okay, how is his biblical exposition on slavery? And are we sure we trust his biblical exposition on women teaching the Bible? And the funniest thing was, on Mother's Day, he goes off and says, women shouldn't preach. Just wanted y'all to know. And I don't know if you saw Beth Moore's response.
Yeah, she's the greatest.
She just replied and said, "Happy Mother's Day, Al." And that was it. Okay, so we got Josh Duggar. That's bugging me.
Yeah.
We got Al Mohler. That's bugging me. He's probably in line to be the next president of the Southern Baptist Convention. Also on Mother's Day, Owen Strahan. I don't know if you...
Just a solid theologian that invents stuff. Yes.
Yeah, he's the director of the Center for Public Theology at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, although he announced he's leaving soon to become the provost of a smaller, even more far-right seminary. He tweeted on Mother's Day a list to encourage women to encourage women. And Kaitlyn, after I say this, you can tell me how encouraging you found this.
Okay.
I don't see gender, but I've been told that you're a woman.
Okay.
And I don't see race, but I've been told that Mike is the color of a marshmallow. So
all of it's true. Everything you said is true.
So Owen Strahan wanted to encourage women on Mother's Day, so he tweeted a list of vocations that God had set aside for women. Things it's okay for women to do vocationally. And on that list of the exciting things that you can look forward to with your life, Kaitlyn, one of the vocations God has set aside for women is knitting. Knitting.
That's news to me.
And this was a list of only about 6 things. So,
Yeah, I saw it.
knitting is apparently when God created the world and then sat down, he said, Adam, name everything, and I'm going to figure out what the genders are for vocations. And he was looking at, needle. What about needlework in general? Oh, that's for women.
To knit me in my mother's womb. So yes, sewing's the thing.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
and one lady with the tent peg. That was a form of knitting. Just through a guy's head. Okay. So here's what. First of all, Kaitlyn, do you want to respond to any of that already? Were you inspired by the list of vocations you could pursue?
We left off changing diapers.
Yeah, that changing diapers was another one. That's a great vocational calling.
Yeah, no, I was not encouraged at all by that. It is funny that I think the people I already know who appreciate all those things the most are women. They already know these are valuable things to do. They just don't like a man telling them these are the things they are limited to doing.
Yeah. I'm giving you a list of things you can do, and assume if it's not on the list, you're not supposed to do it. So, okay, here's my question. I have. I grew up in evangelicalism, my grandparents, great-grandparents, going back forever. I'm proud of my evangelical heritage. I like my evangelical church. I like my evangelical friends. They're good people. But there's so many of these things that keep coming up and up and up. And there's a point where I've tried to convince myself these are all bugs. These are bugs in the system. We just need to get rid of the bugs. And I'm starting to wonder if they're maybe not bugs, that they're actually features of the software. Did we create a culture? Because evangelicalism isn't fundamentally theological. There are some theological distinctives about evangelicalism, but that's not fundamentally what it is. And particularly in America, it's much more cultural than theological. Have we built, if this was software, does it need debugging, or do we need to start again? Mike?
Yes.
That was an A or B.
Just imagine looking around at the world as the president of whatever, SBC, with all the sex scandals and all of the turmoil, and thinking that the thing you really need to point out on Mother's Day is that. I mean, what? And I don't know the person. God bless him, and I'm sure he's a great man. But what sort of world do you live in where that's the application of the good news of Jesus? When your own institutions are rife with awful. So I found that super interesting. My personal opinion is I look at what Jesus did to the disciples of his day. And there were certainly parts of the Judaisms of his day that he held on to, but my goodness, he set a blowtorch to the rest of it. So I personally think these are features and not bugs, and that what's happening in our world with all of this being exposed is of Jesus, blessed by Jesus. Jesus is glad about this. Jesus hates hypocrisy more than we do. And I personally am excited because there will be a tribe formed of very broken, humble people who will no longer assume the superiority that has been embedded in the system. who will actually take their place in the world as co-students and co-learners, who will embody a new and different way of life that may actually look different than the way the rest of the world lives, because it will look and sound and feel more like Jesus rather than the institutional thing we call the church. So I say it's features, and I say Jesus in the process of dismantling it in the same way he dismantled the Judaism of his day, parts of it anyway, held on to the core of it, right? But filtered it all through himself and then opened it up to his disciples. And then they literally spent years unlearning what it was that they had been growing up, being taught. I mean, that's exactly where we're all at. We're all being schooled again by Jesus of actually what it is to love your neighbor. And when Paul says you can know everything and not have love and it's meaningless, well, he was actually right when he said that. So I say, hallelujah, let's burn the sucker down to the base of it.
Okay, but there is a base.
Absolutely.
There is a base.
Cross-shaped Jesus who lived, died, rose again, his teaching, his person, his life, end of story. If it's not that, it's not Christian, period.
What about potlucks?
Yes, he did potlucks. Phil?
Okay, Kaitlyn, anything? Do you agree with Mike? What's your perspective?
Yeah, I think I agree that a lot of the problems we're seeing are features and not bugs, partially because for us to believe that any system that we create, any tradition, any church has problems that are bugs and not features is to assume that the thing we created at its inception was basically good and there wasn't really anything wrong with it. And then along the way, we got some kinks in the system. We had to work them out. But if we really believe in total depravity, then we're going to believe there are features in the very inception of the thing that will manifest in increasingly sometimes worse ways as it goes on. And so for us to think of them as bugs, I think, is to deny some of the important theological things that we hold to when it comes to total depravity and sin.
Can I change my answer? Because that was so much better than my answer. And I want to say amen to Kaitlyn. I just want to say that.
Well, I let her go second, so
that was so
she
smart.
Could form a better answer than you.
Well, no,
I had time.
Just clean it up. I mean,
just clean up. Yeah, could you edit? Could you be Mike's editor? Real-time editor. Okay, Mike, we have a mutual friend, Timothy Gombis, Bible scholar, New Testament scholar at Cornerstone Baptist Seminary, whatever it's called.
Grand Rapids Theological.
Yes.
Grand Rapids Theological, but it's associated with Cornerstone University.
It is.
Right? Okay.
Yes. We're both right, Phil.
We are all right. We are all, bless us all. He did an interesting podcast this week entitled Love Evangelicals, Hate Evangelicalism. And he kind of goes through this process of saying, these are, I think he agrees, these are features. These are not bugs. There's some harmful stuff baked into the root of white American evangelicalism. I'm just from the get-go that it was intended for middle-class white people primarily, that had a target audience, and that audience was white, and many black denominations and other non-white denominations were just not invited to come along for the ride. So, but he's listed other things, like he's listed burnout, the number of evangelical leaders that get completely burnt out because of this obsession with activism. We have to change the world. We have to change the world. We have to change the world. We have to go. We have to go. We have to work. We have to do. Mike, you once pastored a mega church, if I remember correctly.
That is true.
How'd that go for you?
Well, here I am, Phil.
Here I am, dialing in from my hospital room.
Yes, from Columbus, Ohio. No, he is absolutely right. And those, man, when it comes to ecclesiology, those are features of the system. Those are not bugs. The system was designed to entertain and to grow, and consequences or discipleship be damned. And so.
Wait, you said the system was designed to entertain. What do you mean? Is that where puppets come in? What is that?
And vegetables, Phil.
Yeah.
No, I entertain. Amuse is different than entertain, right? Amuse is to hold someone's interest, right? It's
Yeah.
amuse. It's to make something engaging. To
Okay.
entertain is to make people passive, and
Okay.
so
But that's not the early 19th or 20th century reaction to liberal theology was, oh, we don't like the fact that you think the Bible's full of errors, so we're going to be more entertaining. That wasn't part of the fundamentalist. There's no fundamentalist essay on entertaining.
no, that's for sure.
That's more of a post World War II, unless you would look at guys, I guess, like Billy Sunday. If you watch him, some of the early 20th century
Some of the early
evangelists.
revivalists certainly put a
Yeah,
premium on showmanship. That's for sure.
yeah.
But
Have you ever seen There's footage of Billy Sunday preaching. Have you
yes,
seen that? That guy
yes,
is nuts. He's
yeah.
freaking nuts. Okay.
You
So
saw him live though, right?
no, he died in the 30s,
What?
or
That's what I was
40s.
asking.
40s, 30s, 40s, 50s. Okay. 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 He listed burnout as one thing. Yeah, just rampant individualism.
Yeah.
Viewing everything, our theology, our world, everything as just me and the Bible, just me and Jesus, just me and or my family, my nuclear family. Views of women and minorities, and how really in our evangelical tradition, the white middle class is what everything else is measured against.
Hmm.
It's normative. The white middle class Christianity is normative Christianity. Everything else is measured against that. And here's another one I wanted to bring up that occurred to me, because we're talking about whether occasional deconstructing, whether you occasionally look at your own inherited traditions and say,
Hmm.
I'm not sure this part really lines up with Jesus. I'm going to rethink it. Okay. Whether that is a healthy process, because a lot of us are very concerned if our kids start doing that, if our kids start rethinking their inherited beliefs. So, and I'm wondering if that is, if it's a feature of evangelicalism to mistrust reconsidering inherited belief.
Well, when certainty is your highest value, absolutely.
Okay. Which is a mark of fundamentalism, all fundamentalism, not just Christian fundamentalism, but it was the early 20th century belief that liberals were taking away our theology and ruining Christianity, that led to that hyper policing of the theological borders. And then if our kids start reconsidering things, like, they're going to go liberal. In fact, that's what Al Mohler said. That's what Al Mohler said about women preaching, is that it's the reason why mainline denominations have no people in them, because they were feminized by women preachers, which is, Kaitlyn,
Hmm.
Kaitlyn, you
I
feeling
mean,
anything? Do you have any
obvious.
feels?
No, I only have rational thoughts, Phil. I have rational thoughts about this, which are that is ridiculous. But I think part of what's going on between those two concepts is, once you're outside of any kind of structure or tradition, once you've left the mainline denominations, once you are rebuilding institutions, you're not kind of relying on older ones. You don't have established forms of fences, like of pretty reasonable wide fences to go, we can disagree within this broader thing. But if you're going to disagree with what your denomination says, there's a process for that, and you're not always going to win that. When it's this loose network based on like publishing and partnerships and conferences, we have to crack down really hard on stuff, because we don't have any system for dealing with disputes. We don't have any lines that seem clear. And if you don't have lines that are clear from a creed or from a doctrinal statement or whatever, then you have to keep it as small as possible, because you don't want to let it get too big, or that's going to freak everyone out. And then what's even holding us together anymore? So that's what freaks me out a little bit sometimes, when people look at
Right.
evangelicalism and go, this is bad, I don't want to do this. And then repeat the same mistake by going, I don't want to do evangelicalism anymore, so I'm going to go off and just do my own thing over here, apart from any institution or denomination or tradition or church. And I'm just going to kind of hope that it works out better for me than it did for evangelicals when they did that. And it's like, maybe the lesson here is not, if I don't like the institution I'm in or the tradition I'm in, I leave it and start my own thing. Maybe the solution is, I find one that I can live with and I try and influence it to the best I can. I try and be shaped and formed by it. I try to compromise with other people who are different from me within it, not let's all keep striking out and doing our own thing without any accountability or constraints that could actually be good for us to live well together.
Wow. Mike,
No.
you read an email. You read an email.
Just talk to Kaitlyn, man.
You
Dang
read
it.
you read an email on your last podcast where a young woman wrote in and said, I'm deconstructing. I'm trying to rethink what I've inherited. When can I put things back together again? And how do I do it? And she said that line that was so poignant. She said, I don't know how long I can survive without shelter.
Yeah.
That was, what did that do to you to read that? And what do you say to people like that?
Oh my goodness. I think we can all relate, right? I mean, part of the reason why certainty, and I don't mean certainty in the sense of like, I know things are true. I mean, certainty in the way that I hold my beliefs.
Yeah.
So I was taught the Christianity is a whole package, even in the small secondary details. And if you start questioning one part of it, the whole thing could fall. And that's actually not true. And it's not biblical. And it's not the way the faith was presented at all. Faith rests on Jesus, not a book and not a bunch of doctrine. Now, all of that matters isn't important, but that's on the basis of our faith. That helps us put, boundaries and guardrails and explanations to faith. But when you begin to encounter or you begin to realize that the constraints of our inherited faith aren't big enough to describe what's happening in the world or what's happening in us, that's such a scary thing. It does feel like you're abandoning something or you're leaving something. It feels like you're disappointing somebody.
Right, like you're getting out of the rowboat into the ocean and hoping you can find another rowboat somewhere.
Yes, because there's so much, at least for me, there was such clarity and purpose and meaning and significance in being sure about something. And so I so resonated with her comment because that fear, I get that fear and that anxiety and that sort of existential crisis that's like, oh my goodness, if I really am open to this not being true, think about what that opens up. And it's terrifying.
Right.
And so I think for me, the way to respond to myself and others who are like that is to realize I think that is an absolutely necessary part of discipleship to Jesus. That's not something else. Now, it can turn into something.
Unpack that a little more. What is a necessary part of discipleship to Jesus? Exactly.
The dismantling of inherited beliefs, of structures that you thought could hold the weight of meaning and purpose but can't, of authority figures that disappoint, of so I mean I go back to where the disciples started and then how Jesus walks with them in the Gospels and the amount of times where they're like, what? If that's true, then it's better not to be married. I mean, they're just constantly being reintroduced to God.
Yes, but we have the Bible, so now we don't have to have that happen anymore.
Then the funny part is the Bible sets us up for the fact that this is going to keep happening over and over and over because the church in Acts did it. And then Paul and Peter had to do it. I mean, this is the constant, that's why it's called discipleship, right? Because we're always in the posture of student. We're always apprenticing. We're always learning. I think one of the most neglected spiritual disciplines in the Christian community is just being perpetually curious. Right? I'm not afraid. Jesus is not afraid of our questions, our doubts, our struggles. We all agree with that. But there's a sense where, and Dallas Willard just has this great line like he does so often, where someone would ask him a question. He's like, Jesus would be the first one to tell you to pursue the truth wherever it'll go, and he'll find him at the end of it. Right? He's not afraid of that sort of pursuit. So, are there times we can question our faith as a means of resistance, rebel? Of course, absolutely. But that idea of being without shelter, I think so many of us feel like that as the inherited faith has kind of come crumbling down. And I think Jesus encouraged that in his disciples. I think the Spirit encouraged that in the early church. and in the epistles of Paul. And I absolutely think the Bible sets us up to think that's actually the ongoing normal.
I don't like that feeling, Mike. I like things to be buttoned up. I like things to be buttoned up and neat and tidy with an answer to every situation that comes up. I want to be able to know, oh, this is happening in your life. Well, Psalm 32 answers that question, and this is happening in your life.
Right.
And well, Romans 4:17 says, that's not the government's job to give you food stamps.
Yeah, and think about where that approach has got us. Look at the fruit of that approach today.
Yeah.
Right? If you're depressed, pull this verse out. If you're anxious, pull this verse out. And we've been raised on that individualistic sort of consumerism, where we'll take a verse meant for a church, like wives submit to your husbands. That's written to churches. That's not written to nuclear families. And then we'll get Al Mohler doing whatever Al Mohler's going to do, or the poor woman who has to have a confessed freaking child molester in her home because her husband, who is the head of the house, says.
Yeah.
I mean, think about what we've done in approaching the Bible that way.
Yeah. Kaitlyn, what are you thinking?
Just that I feel I also relate to this person who wrote this message about where do I find shelter. And I think one of the things that has become really comforting for me, because I just was talking to some people this morning dealing with questions about women's leadership in the church, and they're changing their mind on stuff. And for women who my answer to that question changes so much for me in a way that it doesn't for a man to ask that question. It's a terrifying thing to go into the waters of like, I grew up believing that if I believe the Bible, then I believe these things about what women can and can't do. And if I start questioning that, is that my own pride? Am I trying to do something I shouldn't do? It's terrifying to feel like suddenly questions are open that weren't open before. And what if I do go down the wrong path and suddenly I believe all these other things I should, it's really scary. But the thing that has been more comforting for me is one, looking at church history, like Mike said, really early, but then also throughout the rest of the history to go, okay, some of these questions people have really dealt with over and over and over again. My struggle with that is I'm not alone in that, but also sometimes they've come to different conclusions, and I can find some comfort in like the diversity that's happened throughout history. But I also can feel some security in knowing that there are certain answers to certain questions that we have decided again and again throughout history are not the right answers. And if I can find, here's the creed, here's the very basic description of what the faith is. If I go outside of that, then there will be a problem. I can feel a little sense of security in that. And that the reason I think that's so important historically is because that's not the security of just my little local church in this moment in time, in this geographic location, saying, here are the only boundaries and you can't go outside, or you can't, instead it's me going, what have Christians throughout all of time and across the world believed? And sometimes, when we are dealing with questions about women, we have thought really bad things about women for a really long time. So it's not foolproof to say if we've believed one thing for the whole time, then, we should just go with that. But it's helpful to go, okay, there's been some diversity on questions like women, questions like atonement theories, questions like how we do church. But then there are things that are super consistent, and especially consistent across the world in different cultural contexts. And then I can go, okay, there's not all questions and all answers, and I'm swimming in the sea and I'm going to drown. There are some clear guidelines that I can find in history, and I can find some comfort and some shelter in that. But then within that, I can find also comfort from knowing people have struggled and asked questions for a long time. And my momentary discomfort with asking those questions can actually be a place that leads me to greater trust in God instead of in those institutions or humans that can fail me.
Wow. Okay, Mike.
Is it hard being that smart, Kaitlyn? Is it? I'm just saying, is that a struggle?
You should have talked to her before she started at Dallas, because she had a hard time connecting three words together. They did
Dallas,
an astonishing.
Dallas, man, it must be great.
Astonishing job.
Phil has no idea.
I know, but I can act like I do, right?
Sure.
No, but
sure.
Kaitlyn, that's brilliant. That we lack any historical referent for any of these conversations. We think they're all brand new.
Yeah.
And one of the things I love, Phil, that you do, and Skye and Kaitlyn, is that you give perspective, and you're like, this is not new, guys. We don't have to be afraid of this.
Right.
These are paths believers have been walking for years.
It's little things. just learning more history, like, right now, the vast majority of very conservative Christians believe the earth is 6,000 years old. 100 years ago, almost no conservative Christians believed the earth was 6,000 years old. 200 years before that, almost all conservative Christians believed the earth was 6,000 years old. So it changed. It's like tie width. It's like, are we wearing fat tires or skinny ties this year? I didn't get the memo. There are trends in belief. Everyone was post-millennial in the 19th century, and then we all turned premillennial into 20th century. And then we assume we've always been premillennial because that's what my church is, or Dallas Theological Seminary, or whatever, but this is okay. Again, I'm going to ask you each the same question. And they just came up
So
with this.
why are you getting out of answering all these? That's what I want to know.
I don't, guys, I'm the host.
Why do you get to do news of the butt, and then we have to do the heavy lifting?
Because it's my show, Mike.
Okay.
It's my darn show, and I never swear on it like some people in their podcasts.
Kaitlyn. I was so offended when you did that.
Okay, Mike.
No, wait, we really have to tell my mom I did not swear on Mike's show, okay?
Mrs. Schiess, Kaitlyn doesn't swear on shows.
At least out loud, maybe in her head.
Okay, Mike, and I'm going to ask you both. I'm going to ask you both this question. Given all of this mess, given all this freaking mess,
yes,
the Josh Duggars, the women, hey, you got knitting, so consider yourself lucky that we've given you knitting. Okay, why don't you just chuck the whole thing? Why are you still here?
Oh, I mean, that's easy. And it's so cliche, but can I tell a brief story?
Oh, sure.
Okay. So I'm 29. So this is just a couple of years ago. All right. And I'm a college Why are you laughing, Kaitlyn?
You said you just turned 50 like 2 minutes ago. You're not fooling us, Mike.
No, mentally 50, physically 29.
Okay. So things aren't going well upstairs.
The decline is real. I'm a college pastor. I'm in seminary. I go to a retreat with my college students, and this dude named Bart Tarman. All right. He was back then a chaplain at Westmont College, was a legend kind of in the West Coast, was the speaker. And he holds up a Bible and he tells this story. And this is my answer. He tells a story. Westmont is a Christian college. So he had some seniors come to him and ask, Hey, Bart, would you disciple us? And Bart, because these were really good guys, was kind of hard on him. And he said, hey, I'd think about it, but when was the last time you picked up one of the Gospels and just read it because you were compelled by the person of Jesus? Not for homework, not for an assignment, but you just sat down and read one of the biographies. And all these kids, the students that were asking said, well, they never had. And then the 1,000 of us in the room, as he's telling this story, are thinking, well, we never had either. And so he holds up a Bible, and he literally has Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and then John. And he holds it up, and just by that part, right? Just so it's like this, for those of you that can't see, it's just this tiny part of a book. And he says, so let me get this straight. You've given your lives to Jesus. You sing worship songs to Jesus. You want to serve Jesus. You want to share Jesus. And you've never taken the time to read. And it's just this tiny little bit of ink. One of the only authoritative accounts of his life. And we're all just, and he tells the story. It's dead silent in the room. And I'm sitting there like, oh my Lord, that's me. I am that person. And so I just began reading Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the easiest Bible reading program in the history of the world. And that totally and radically and forever reshaped my faith. I had been a Christian and had not really been introduced to Jesus. And so for me, he is utterly and absolutely, and the more I get to know him, the more compelled I am by his beauty. This is the story I want to be true. This is the story, as Rachel Held Evans says, I'm glad if I'm going to be wrong about any story, I want to be wrong about this one. There's something here that is magnificent and strikes at the core of what it is to be human. And so that's the reason. And as Kaitlyn pointed out, several minutes ago, baked into that story is the realization that we're not going to get it right. We're all going to be messing this thing up as we go. And yet, God is so great, he will weave that into something that will end up being very beautiful. And so that, for me, that's the reason.
That's a pretty good reason. Okay, Kaitlyn, you got anything? You're a few years behind Mike in life experience.
Just 3 or 4. Say it, Kaitlyn, just 3 or 4.
3 or 4.
Oh, mentally, you might be ahead of him.
No doubt. No doubt about that.
Why? Okay, Kaitlyn, you're young. You got your whole life in front of you. You could go do anything. You're bright. You could be, you could go into politics. You could go into whatever. You could build a business.
Knitting.
I could do that.
Why are you going to hang your life on Jesus?
So I feel like there's an answer to that question that is different from the answer to why I'm staying in the church.
Okay. Sure.
The answer to the first question is just, I love Jesus and he came in and changed my life and it has never been the same. I've had doubts and questions, but I cannot imagine a life without being in love with Jesus and living like that was true. And growing up with people who showed me that in really incredible ways made it easier. But the answer to the second question really is that, I, over the last year, have had just a really horrible experience with church. I lost a job over political chaos at my church and was really deeply hurt and saw the consequences of that in really awful ways. And I think if there was ever going to be a moment when I questioned being a part of a church, when I questioned the way that I think God has called me to speak into the life of the church, it would be right after all of that happened. I mean, if there's ever going to be a moment when I thought, like, let's just give up on all of this, it would be right after that. And by the grace of God, I feel like right after that was the moment when I was like, I am more in love with the church than I have ever been, because I have seen really horrible stuff. And yet I also have seen really beautiful stuff. And I love it so much because I see the brokenness and because I see what it can be, what I believe God's intention for his people is. And when I see where we don't match up, it almost makes my love for the church fiercer, because it's like, I want this to be different. I want this to be better. I also don't know a life outside of a community of people that, for all of their mistakes, for the times they will hurt me, have also kept me in check, have been the first people that put little felt board Jesuses on a felt board and showed me who he was and told me stories and took care of me and brought food to potlucks. And I can't give up on that. And so I don't have a good theological answer so much as I have an experiential answer of, in the moment when I think I would most be likely to just give up on this whole thing, God miraculously gave me a stronger love for this, really messed up, but also beautiful family of God. And I can't really get around that. Even if logically I would think, oh, this is too messy, I can't keep up with this. I do believe that God has given us the miraculous gift of the church, and the Holy Spirit will be faithful to sustain it. And I'm hanging my head on that.
It's a pretty good answer. It's a pretty good answer, isn't it, Mike?
Well, that gives me hope that there are people like our sister here, who have seen it all and have tasted some of the worst and still have hope. That's pretty freaking awesome.
Well, Mike, I have been to a Christian trade show where a major Christian music company had a money booth where you go inside and they turn on the fan that blows dollar bills all over, and then you try to grab as much money as fast as you can. That was an actual thing at an actual Christian trade show for Christian retailers to participate in. A literal money grab. And having seen that with my own eyes, I am still committed to the church.
Yeah.
Because that's not the church. That's a distortion within the church. If you got a bad pew, I'm not saying it, but there are bigger issues. There are bigger systemic issues in evangelicalism where it's not just, oh, it's a bad apple. It's just a bad apple. No, and one of Tim Gomes's conclusions, which kind of surprised me, but I kind of see where he's coming from, is, he loves evangelicals. He doesn't love evangelicalism. He's not going to use the name. He's not going to be part of a movement. His commitment is to his local church, not to some movement. And I kind of get that. Now, if enough people say, yeah, I want to do what he's doing, I think he's formed a movement. And I think we're right back to the same problem again. But I get where he's coming from. So my commitment is not to evangelicalism, which is one of the squishiest, undefinable. I mean, it's like critical race theory. What is it? I don't know. What is it to you? Because if what it is to you is offensive, then I'm against it. If what it is to you is not offensive, then I'm for it. What is evangelicalism? Nobody knows. No one has a clue. So, but Jesus, I can learn who Jesus is. Yeah. And I can follow Jesus. And if brothers and sisters are following him with me, we've formed the church. And that's, I had this conviction a few years ago because I'm such an introvert. You can't Christian alone. You can't. It is not possible. You can do Bible study alone. You can have a quiet time alone, but you can't Christian alone. So I have to Christian with other Christians, or I'm not Christianing. And I want to Christian even more than I want to evangelical, whatever that is. So
is that why you have a Christian on the show?
Yes.
Just to make sure, just to embody that.
I can't Christian alone. I need another Christian.
Yes.
All right. You guys are awesome. Thanks so much. Mike, thanks for jumping in last minute when Skye was unavailable.
Are you kidding? This is guys, you're doing such great work. Kaitlyn, you are so fun and such a rock star. I am so honored to do this. So thanks for having me.
We will have you back. Kaitlyn, thanks again. Congratulations on your degree.
Yeah.
Thanks.
And we hope you have a great summer. And we will talk to you in a couple more weeks. Hey, everybody. Thanks for supporting us on Patreon. You're really making it easier for us to commit the time that it's taking to do this well. And I love doing it well. So we will talk to you all next week. Goodbye.
Can I share something with you that's really bugged me for a while? So many of our churches talk about having a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. And we talk about how Christianity is a relationship, it's not a religion. And all that's fine and good, but when do our churches actually teach us how to have a relationship with Jesus Christ? A few years ago, a nationwide survey of church leaders asked them to rank their priorities. Not surprisingly, things like preaching and outreach ranked among the top. You know what was dead last? Prayer. Only 3% of church leaders said that prayer was a priority. So of course, why would it be a priority in our churches or among our people? We talk about having a relationship with Jesus Christ, but we don't actually practice having a relationship with him, which is what prayer is really supposed to be all about. One of the things that's so surprising about that survey is how different it is from Jesus' first disciples. They could have asked him how to do all kinds of things, like how to preach a great sermon or how best to free people from oppression. But when they had a chance to ask Jesus specifically how to do something, they asked him how to pray. That's why I wrote my new book, What If Jesus Was Serious About Prayer? Because I think it's an area that many of us simply haven't been serious about, and certainly not most of our churches. But this simple book will introduce you to what Jesus taught about prayer and how to actually commune with him the way he taught us to. And it does it with simple short chapters and simple illustrations and drawings and doodles that are accessible to anyone. So if you're hungry for that deeper communion with God, and if for you prayer isn't at the very bottom of your priority list, then I highly recommend you pre-order my new book, What If Jesus Was Serious About Prayer? A visual guide to the spiritual practice most of us get wrong, and begin to transform your life with God today. What is the proper role for women in the church today? You already heard Phil and Kaitlyn and Mike talk about that a little bit in the previous segment, but my conversation today is with someone who has thought a lot about it, and not just from a current events point of view or even a theological point of view, but from history's point of view. Beth Allison Barr is a history professor at Baylor University and the Associate Dean of the Baylor Graduate School. Her new book is called The Making of Biblical Womanhood: How the Subjugation of Women Became Gospel Truth. In the book, she gives us a broad survey of how we've come to the contemporary popular evangelical view of women, weaving together both a certain interpretation of Paul's writings in the New Testament, as well as a certain understanding of cultural values that came out of modernity and contemporary Western culture. But then she goes a step further and shows us how the role of women has actually changed dramatically throughout the centuries of the church, with a major shift happening between the medieval and Reformation periods. And once we understand that the role of women hasn't been static and actually has a lot of different interpretive views throughout history, well, it might just make us question our own views about it today. This conversation with Beth Allison Barr was wide-ranging and fantastic, and I'm happy to tell you that for our Patreon supporters, there's a great bonus segment interview that you can listen to about how our modern English translations have been shifted and shaped in order to emphasize one view of women or another. So if you are a Patreon subscriber, stay tuned for that. It'll be coming to you soon. And if you're not a Patreon subscriber, what better time than now to sign up and get that kind of great bonus content? Okay, here is my conversation with Beth Allison Barr. Beth Allison Barr, welcome to the Holy Post.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you've been on Twitter talking about coming on the show, and we've appreciated the cross-promotion for sure.
Well, I always have to advertise, there's just something about talking with y'all is just really fun.
All right, so you wrote this book, The Making of Biblical Womanhood. And we actually had a little bit of a debate on our team about who should interview you. And my instinct was it's bad to have a woman interview you because that's just going to look like we're talking about a women's issue when this is not just a women's issue. So I was interested in reading the book anyway. I finished it all. I loved it. It was really thoughtful. I mentioned to you before we started that I was a history major. You're a history professor. So you bring a ton of history into this. But I want to begin with very recent history.
Sure.
which is the use of the word complementarian.
Yes.
In this whole conversation about the role of women, both in the church and in the world, essentially. You argue that complementarian is really just a rebranding of patriarchy. Why the rebranding?
Why the rebranding? I think because they didn't like the way the word patriarchy sounded. And so there's an interesting, in the 1980s, there was an article that came out, I think in the Journal of Evangelical Theological Society, where they took this word complementarian that before that had actually been used by egalitarians to talk about male, female, that there are still gender differences, or there's, people still can have different roles, complementary roles, but they really can also be equally called. And this term was then taken over by those who espouse female submission and male headship. And they used it because, and I really think it was just because the term patriarchy received negative feedback.
Okay.
As a historian, it's interesting to me because this word complementarity was also used in the, in the 18th and the 19th century, in the Enlightenment era, to talk about how women are called to submissive roles, whereas men are called to leadership roles. So I wonder, I'm not sure if some of that was in their background. They may have not known that, but I think it was mostly because patriarchy didn't sound as good.
But some folks still use patriarchy as a correct definition of what they're advocating for, but differentiate Christian patriarchy from pagan patriarchy. In other words, patriarchy itself is not the problem. It's just in its unsanctified form that we have problems.
Exactly.
You see it differently. What's the difference?
Yes, I do see it differently. Russell Moore, of course, and I just feel so bad calling Russell Moore out because I really like Russell Moore. But in the early 2000s, he wrote this article where he argued that, the problem is that Christians are doing patriarchy like the world instead of doing it the way that God calls us to do it, and that Christian patriarchy is what we should be adhering to. And he said that Christian patriarchy is when wives submit only to their husbands, whereas pagan patriarchy, that's his word, pagan patriarchy, is where women are called to submit to all men. And he says in the Christian world, wives are only called to submit to their husbands. So this isn't sort of, he said they're not supposed to be submissive to any other men in the church or any other men. And I think maybe part of his argument too was for women to be able to work in the workplace, that sort of maybe going against what John Piper and Wayne Grudem have suggested, where there are roles that women shouldn't have in the workplace because those put them in leadership positions that they shouldn't have. So I think maybe Russell Moore was speaking into that conversation.
Okay.
The problem is that it just doesn't work that way. When you say that women, there's something about them that causes them to be unable to have leadership roles in the home and also in the church, then what that does is that automatically puts women on a second tier. And so
Okay, we're going to get into some of the biblical texts in a minute, including the household codes, which I loved what you did with those. But before that, I want to kind of go toward the end of the book because you caught my attention. This is page 173. I have my copy, and it's very well marked up. Page 173, you mentioned one of my favorite movies, The Usual Suspects.
Oh, yeah. You get along with my husband then.
Yeah, I was in college at the time. It's just that era, those movies, they kind of resonate with you. One of the best twists ever at the end, not to ruin it or spoil it for anybody, but the villain is revealed with this voiceover where he says, quote, "The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist." Great line, classic movie. You adapt that quote and you say the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing Christians that oppression is godly.
Yeah.
Okay. And then later in this chapter, you identify two primary drivers of patriarchy that supposedly give Christians permission to oppress women, more or less. And the first is biblical inerrancy. And this caught my attention because many years ago when I was an editor at Christianity Today, I was traveling to interview a well-known kind of young, restless, and reformed type leader who shall remain nameless. And in my interview, I kind of asked him to summarize his theology, and he was a Calvinist, so he laid out the 5-point tulip Calvinist kind of thing, but then he added complementarian onto the end. And it caught me by surprise. And I said, well, I understand the other 5. Why complementarian? Why do you rank it as such an essential part of your theology? And he said biblical inerrancy. He used it, as many do, as a litmus test for how seriously do you take Scripture and what's your hermeneutical device by which you interpret it. And they see if you give women equal roles, that you don't take the Bible seriously, which all speaks to this inerrancy thing. Talk about the history of that and why inerrancy was necessary for the modern patriarchal view to be established.
Yeah, so this has been, I sort of had this bet going on about where I was going to get the most pushback against the book. And I thought maybe it would be my Paul chapter or my writing women out of the English Bible chapter. But someone along the way said, oh no, Beth, it's going to be inerrancy. It's like, that's it. You're going down for inerrancy. And that actually seems to be the case. It seems to be this inerrancy. And Michael Bird wrote something really good yesterday, in which he said that the problem with inerrancy is that inerrancy is supposed to apply to what we believe about Scripture, but instead it's used to apply to our own interpretation of Scripture. Right. And this is what happened in the 20th century, is that our own interpretation of Scripture that began to be interpreted, really it started during that fundamentalist modernist controversy, and a group of, Princeton theological folk, and it sort of grew out from that and hit into the Baptist world, etc. But they said that inerrancy is not just believing the Bible, but it's believing the Bible this way. And with that, you can think about, Warfield's quote here, where it doesn't matter what you think about Paul. Paul said, women are to be silent, and that's it. That's the bottom line. Right. And so this is this attitude, and this is a really relatively new attitude. It really appears with a vengeance in the early part of the 20th century. It starts appearing in the late 19th century. I think it's connected to women's suffrage. At this time, this is also when we can look at and I know you're going to do this later, but we think about Junia, who gets written out as a female apostle in Romans 16. This starts in the 19th century. Historians have speculated. Somebody needs to do the hard work and see if it's connected. But all of us suspect that the reason Junia's name why she starts being changed to a man, is to undercut female leadership in the Bible at the same time that to undercut the suffrage argument. As we have all of these women pushing for suffrage.
It feels a little bit to me that the women in the New Testament, or those relevant texts, suffer from the same dilemma of Genesis 1 when it comes to this inerrancy argument. The phrase you hear all the time is the plain and literal reading of the text, right? So a plain and literal reading of Genesis 1 led to young earth creationism, anti-Darwinianism, all of that. But then
Right.
come along scholars like John Walton, who's a friend of ours here at Wheaton. He's been on the show many times, and
Yeah.
he not chooses, but understands Genesis through the lens of the original audience that it was written
Right.
for, which then changes the way you read and understand Genesis. Similarly, some of these writings of Paul, of course, have to be read through the lens of a first century Jewish or Roman audience. And that
Right.
may well change the way you understand women be silent in some of the other texts. But
That's exactly
the
right.
inerrantist wants to say, no. It just needs to be read in 20th or 21st century American English, and whatever it says is what it says, and that's that, and don't read
Exactly.
any deeper. But doesn't it undercut the very point of the modern fundamentalist debate, or the inerrantist, which is trying to hold up the authority of Scripture?
Yes, it does. I've been trying, as somebody who lives in this world and has been dealing with this and trying to also deal with it from a pastoral perspective, because when people have, the last thing you want to do is pull the rug out of somebody's, if they're holding these things so tightly, you don't want to pull the rug out from them where their whole faith shatters. And
Sure.
so you want them to understand that maybe the reason they're seeing things this way is not because of the Bible, but because of the glasses they're wearing. And so I think that's what I was attempting to do, was to help people see that when you wear different glasses, it doesn't change the authority of Scripture. It simply changes how you see them. And when you look at it from the perspective of the original audience, it changes what I call the little stories of the Bible. This is one of the things that I really want people to get across, is that we're not talking about major narratives in the Bible that are changed dramatically. And the story of Jesus comes through, the story of God reaching down and bringing, and rescuing humanity. I mean, that story comes through the entire Bible. But these little stories that affect people's lives, like slavery, like the oppression of women, these are stories that, when we don't take the original context into account, it dramatically changes how we see the text, and we see it through the lens of our own human desires rather than through the lens of how they were originally created. And
Okay.
that's not, I hate that word, originally, but anyway, how their audience took at them.
So I suspect that what's going on here, and we'll talk about the Reformation in a little bit, is since the Reformation, the emphasis in Protestant Christianity has been upon the unmediated communion of the individual with God, and very closely related to that, the unmediated engagement of the individual with God's word.
Right.
And so the emphasis then has to be on the accessibility of God's word, that you, the untrained individual believer, can open up this book, read it plainly, and apply it to your life. Yeah. But you come along, or John Walton comes along, or I come along and say, actually, the untrained reader is going to misunderstand some things because they don't know history or context or language or whatever the nuance might be. And in order to properly understand Genesis, or 1 Corinthians 14, whatever it might be, you need more information. But that puts a barrier up between the untrained individual and the word of God. And a lot of Protestants react to that, saying, no, that's going to complicate the faith, and it's going to create a new hierarchy, and it's going to create a new priesthood. And so I wonder if some of the resistance to an egalitarian approach to women isn't all rooted in patriarchy, but partly rooted in this desire to keep Christianity as simple and accessible as possible, and therefore keep scholarship out of it. It's sort of the anti-intellectualism that
it is.
That what's his name, Noel, wrote about so many years ago.
Oh yeah. It is definitely some of the anti-intellectualism, but also with some of that. I mean, some of it is simply the approach that we have to reading the Bible. I mean, the way that we read the Bible today is different than people have ever read the Bible before or used the Bible before. I mean, this whole idea that a layperson is expected to be able to completely understand and take literally everything that's in the Bible. This is an extremely modern concept. It's not that people haven't read and believed the Bible in the past. It's not even that medieval people didn't have access to the Bible. I mean, that's something I just wrote an article about that for an Oxford book on how accessible the medieval Bible was to ordinary people. It's just that the strategies that we use to read in our 20th century and 21st century world have changed dramatically. And so I do think that, and the way they've changed is connected to anti-intellectualism. So I do think that that is part of the story. But we also have to remember that part of this anti-intellectualism was built into these fundamentalist movements that were already entrenched in male leadership and keeping women out. And many of these folk were, the suffrage movements and so forth. So I don't think you can separate them. I think they go together.
That's a good point. And when you look at the current manifestation of anti-intellectualism among Christian communities in this pandemic, you see the anti-science, anti-mask, anti-vax, conspiracy theory, and it all relies on the layperson having massive amounts of information available to them through the internet and refusing to allow that information to be interpreted by anyone else.
Right.
And I that same thing's at play here in some of these more complicated passages of the New Testament that, frankly, require a scholarly investigation, and some people just resist that.
It's also, with anti-intellectualism too, it's not that they're rejecting all authorities. They're just only accepting some authorities. So, they're often reading these through the lens of, Desiring God podcasts and through the, blog posts and through the lens of CBMW essays, and not even considering the perspective of other folk who are just as faithful Christians. And so that's part of the barrier I was trying to break down too, was helping people see, even if you read my book and land exactly where you were before you started it, if you even are able to consider that people from a different perspective can also be faithful Christians, that's a win for me.
Yeah. Okay. So, I wanted to talk about Arianism or the resurgence of Arianism, but we're going to jump over that for time purposes. Okay. And I really want to spend time talking about medieval Christianity and the Reformation, because the medieval world is your world, right? That is your area of study and expertise. And I was intrigued by that part of the book. I have a bunch of questions about it, but just for the sake of our listeners, briefly, if you can, describe the shift in understanding of women from the medieval period to the Reformation period, as it, of course, relates to faith.
I really can do this briefly. So in the medieval world, patriarchy still exists in the medieval world, but because of what they believed about the female body, they believed that the reason women couldn't be priests and couldn't be leaders in the medieval church was because their bodies were flawed. They had this Greco-Roman Aristotelian understanding that there was something inherently wrong with the female body. And so that is what makes women unable to have the sort of same leadership qualities and to reach God the same way that men can. However, medieval people also believed that you could overcome your bodies. And so they believed that women, by forsaking the things that made them most feminine, by forsaking marriage, by forsaking childbearing, those things, and by surrendering themselves completely to God, that they could become like men. One of my favorite, ways this is phrased in a medieval sermon is it says, "Women and God be men." And so women could be preachers, teachers, and leaders if they had moved away enough, forsaken those female roles, and become more like men.
So the monastic movement, in other words.
In some ways, I shy away from using the monastic because it's not just monastic women. We have all these women running around who are actually vowesses. They're not actually, they're not virgins. They're not living in monasteries. They're all over the place. Marjorie Kemp is one of these women. Mm-hmm. So they're women religious. Let's use that term. That's a more comprehensive term.
Okay.
But this loophole goes away when we move to the Reformation, because in the medieval world, I always, the ranking, and this was really the ranking that was used, is in heaven, virgins, people dedicated to God, got 100 points. Widows got 60 points, and wives are on the bottom of the totem pole. They only get 30 points in God's kingdom, okay, if they die while they're still alive. This flips after the Reformation, where suddenly the most important thing that a woman can be is a godly wife, which means that legally she's always under the authority of her husband. So we get suddenly what comes together is this tying of a woman's godly, wifely role with legal subordination. And women, And so that's the shift.
You write on page 117, Reformation theology may have removed the priest, but it replaced him with the husband.
Yes.
So patriarchy is still there, but it's shifted a little bit. Okay, here's what I'm trying to get my head around. It seemed to me in your writing that you were lamenting the loss of this option that medieval women had for a religious vocation by forsaking some of the more feminine aspects of their identity as mothers or wives, things like that. But I'm trying to, I can't, it seems like it's not a net loss or gain necessarily in the Reformation, because I'm assuming prior to the Reformation, most women were married. Just by the
they
right.
were.
So
those women were married.
Whereas, and a lot of medieval Christianity, basically, as you put it, put them at the bottom of the totem pole. So Luther, Calvin, and other reformers come along and they bring out this theology of vocation and priesthood of all believers. And in a sense, it offers more dignity to more women to say, hey, being a mother, being a wife is a legitimate vocation in which you can commune with God and have legitimacy in the eyes of faith. But it didn't give them any role apart from submission to their husbands. So it's a trade-off where more women have spiritual validity, but they don't have any independence. So go ahead.
Well, no, you're exactly right. That's the argument historians have been having for years, because it does elevate the role of wife, and most women were wives. And so in some ways that's a win for women. But at the same time, as I said, my main argument is that patriarchy shapeshifts. And that's what I want people to understand, is that women are always subordinate. Women are always submissive in human culture. But the way that the church adapts why women are submissive according to culture, not according to the Bible. And so this is just simply how patriarchy shapeshifts. I think the biggest thing I would lament for the modern world is you can see why single women are left out of the modern evangelical church today, why they don't really have a place. I mean, this is a huge problem. Because, in an ideal world, women would be able to do whatever they are called to do, and that would be considered to be equally valid. In the medieval world, however, wives were at the bottom, single women were at the top. In the modern world, single women are at the bottom, wives are at the top.
Right.
So
it seems like in the medieval world, women had to forsake their bodies in order to be in a religious vocation. And in the post-Reformation world, women had to forsake a religious vocation in order to be in the home. And the modern world is trying to say women don't have to forsake their bodies. They can be wives and mothers, and they can have a religious vocation. It's not a mutually exclusive choice.
Right. I'll let you continue. You can
you're building the case that the continuity from the Reformation to today is that we have so solely emphasized women as wives, mothers, household, and in the realm of the household, that we've lost any imagination prior to the Reformation for women to have these religious vocations that they had throughout Christian history and even in the New Testament. So we have to suppress that evidence because it doesn't fit with the narrative we want.
Exactly.
So that'll get us into the New Testament, which that's kind of working back to. But anything you want to add about the medieval era that we should be aware of that we are not being taught about the role of women in the church?
Oh my gosh, there's so much we are not taught. Yeah, it is. But I can just simply say, I think women are all over the church landscape of history, preaching, teaching, serving, even as wives and mothers. And women today are just not taught that. I mean, this is really I think probably one of the biggest things that I was trying to get across was how little evangelicals really know about church history. And if we actually knew that, it would greatly broaden our perspective about women and men in the church.
Yeah, it's been an annoyance of mine for a long time that even people who have some awareness of church history, it tends to go from Paul to Luther,
Yeah.
Calvin to Billy Graham. And that's kind of it. And you skip over 1,500 years of church history.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or if they know, go on.
Let's do New
We
Testament.
won't talk about Thomas Aquinas. Yeah.
Let's do some New Testament, because this is what people ultimately get snagged on when they're having these conversations in their own communities. You do a deep dive into a couple of texts that I want to touch on. First, let's talk about 1 Corinthians 14. Mm-hmm. Paul's famous text, verses 33 to 36, where he talks about women should be silent. And you link what Paul says there to almost the sarcasm he uses elsewhere in the letter, where he quotes he quotes pagan sources, almost like the way Jesus quoted the Old Testament, where he had said, "You've heard it said such and such, but I say to you,"
exactly right,
this other thing. So explain how that comes into play and the link with Cato.
Yeah. So the text that I chose in this chapter, I've said this before, I originally did not want to write a Paul chapter because I was so irritated about how this conversation has become mired in simply debating what we believe about this text. And I'm like, there's no path forward in this. So I really didn't want to do it. My husband convinced me that I had to do it. And so I was like, okay, yeah.
And to be clear, not because you have to submit to what your husband tells you to do in the book, but he's also theologically trained and was arguing. Well,
yeah.
Yeah.
He knows this audience. And he was just like, Beth, it's not going to work. It's not going to work unless you do Paul. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to do Paul the way I teach Paul. These are my teaching examples that I use in my classroom. And the one that I use in 1 Corinthians 14 is one that actually came to me when I was having lunch with a famous New Testament scholar. He used to be one of the most significant New Testament scholars in the U.S. His name is Charles Talbert. And I was having lunch with him, and I'd just been teaching on the early part of the Roman Empire, of the Roman Republic. And we had been reading Livy, and who has Cato's speech recorded in here about the aftermath of the Opium Law. And the Opium Law was something that was put in place. It was a wartime measure to try to get these wealthy women, widows essentially, and these new women to give some of their money to the empire, to the Republic, so that they could build up the army and defeat the Carthaginians. And so this is sort of the context of it. But after the war is over and Rome wins, they lift the sanctions on men, but they keep the sanctions on women in place. And the women were just so angry about it. And they stormed the Senate and trying to get the men to change their minds and to lift this law. And so we have this great speech by Cato the Elder in there that Livy records for us. And Livy's, of course, in the aftermath. He's a couple of centuries after, 3 centuries after this. But nonetheless, Livy's recording it. And the words that he uses Cato saying is, what are these women doing running around in the streets? Why don't they ask their husbands privately at home? As soon as we allow women to influence us, they are going to rule us. I mean, I love the way that he ends this letter. And I was talking about it, and I just made an offhand comment to Charles Talbert. I said, every time I read that, it makes me think of Corinthians. And he just looked at me and he said, well, why do you think that is, Beth? And I just sat there and I was like, oh my gosh, is that a Corinthian quotation? And he was like, go back and read the text.
Yeah.
And ever since, it really blew my mind that day, because I went back and I read it and I was like, he is so right. That is what Paul is doing there. Or, it seems to me that's what these are Roman words. These aren't Paul's words. And that's why they don't really fit in that passage. Everybody talks about how they're kind of jarring and, why do they fit there? But if Paul is saying, look, as he's talking about order and worship, and he's talking about, all sorts of, and he says, look, you say that women aren't supposed to do this, that they're supposed to ask their husbands at home. What? Did the word of God originate with you? That's what he follows with. And if you put that in the context of what else? I mean, Paul tells women they can prophesy. Paul tells them that they can speak in tongues. Paul names Junie as an apostle, gives Phoebe the book of Romans and tells her to take it home, which means she read it. Paul is not telling women not to talk. Anyway, that's
So to those who are unfamiliar with the original texts here in the original language in Greek, the New Testament does the manuscripts we have includes no punctuation, no spacing, no
Right.
paragraph breaks, none of that. So if Paul's quoting a Roman source, for example, that has to be deciphered from context. It's not explicitly in the text itself. So it's a plausible interpretation that that's exactly what's going on here. Paul's quoting
Right.
Roman sources and basically flipping it on its head, saying, we don't operate this way. But modern translators have not picked up on that because we're 2,000 years removed from that cultural context. And so people have taken women be silent as what Paul is saying rather than what he's quoting
Right.
pagan sources as saying. Okay,
Yeah.
the other thing that we got to talk about are household codes, which occur in many of Paul's letters. A lot of people know the structure that first half of Paul's letters often has to do with a lot of theology about the gospel and things, and then the latter part of is applying it to circumstances of the churches. And he often talks about the household and those core relationships: husbands, wives, parents, children, slave masters. We again read those from the 21st century and see them perhaps as somewhat repressive. But again, we have to read them as the first century audience would have read them. Explain why Paul's household codes aren't what we think they are.
Yeah. So because male authority is not at the center of Paul's household codes, this is so obvious when you read through them and compare them to household codes that come from the Greco-Roman world. I used Aristotle. He's not the only one. Household codes like this are pretty common.
Right.
And what they all center on is on male authority. And the household codes of the Greco-Roman world are usually men talking to men about men. And what we see in the household codes in the New Testament is Paul talking to wives, husbands, children, slaves, all together. And he envisions them all together in the same room. This is completely against what would have happened in most usual, Roman households. They're all gathered in one space. Carolyn Osick does a wonderful job talking about the early house churches. But they're all gathered in one space. And then the conversation targets all of the different members as if they are part of the conversation. This again, just shows us how radically different this is from this usual household codes that targeted and supported male authority. And instead of Paul telling, in the Roman world, legally, husbands had the power of life and death over their wives. Now, that doesn't mean they all used it. Not all of them were awful people, but some of them were. We talk about stories in my class, like the murder of Regula, who was murdered by her husband, and then he got away with it, was essentially led off by Marcus Aurelius. And so they legally had this power of life and death over their wives. And Paul remarkably tells husbands that they are to love their wives as Christ loves the church. So instead of emphasizing their power over women, he emphasizes how they are to give up their lives for their wives. And I really like how Rachel Held Evans, I know a lot of people don't respond well to her name. I think she got a bad shake of things early on. People were very unkind to her, but she was right about this. And she said that it's a Jesus remix, that Paul is doing a Jesus remix. And I love that because I think she's right. And we miss it because we read it through the lens of male authority,
right.
Which is just not at all what it was trying to do.
Okay, so two things. Number one, it feels to me like these household codes should be taken as somewhat descriptive of the reality of the ancient world rather than prescriptive. Paul's just acknowledging the fact that it is a patriarchal world, but he's calling in every relationship, he calls upon the person with power, the husband, the father, the master, to use it in a Christ-like way, which is a radical remix, to use Rachel Held Evans' term. But to play devil's advocate for a second, somebody who still advocates for what Russell Moore deemed Christian patriarchy would say, these texts don't dismantle patriarchy. They simply say it should be done in a Christ-like loving manner. So how do you then push it to say, no, these are a first century step toward dismantling patriarchy, which is where we ought to take it in the 21st century.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is thinking about what Paul is doing here. I don't think Paul's trying to dismantle patriarchy. I think
Right.
Paul is trying to tell the church how to live in the society that they are living in a Christ-like way that spreads the gospel. I don't think Paul's not a feminist. I don't think he cares about that. I mean, that's a modern term.
Right.
But what Paul, I don't know if it would have occurred to, I think Paul's very utilitarian. Paul doesn't limit. Paul's like, okay, Phoebe, you can go to Rome. You have the money. You have the skills to read this letter. I need you to go. And he sends Phoebe. I don't really he thinks about that, oh, she's not qualified to go because she is technically under. I don't think he thinks that way. I think he thinks about how the gospel is used and how we can push the gospel out there. And he uses the people who are available and the people who are willing. And so in that sense, I guess he is sort of dismantling patriarchy, but I don't think that's his intention. I think he's utilitarian.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You see something similar with Timothy and circumcision, right? He rails against circumcision as a qualifier for being part of the people of God, and he doesn't want people to do it. But then he gets Timothy circumcised because they need to get into these synagogues, and it's a practical reality for Paul. So he's a practical missionary first and foremost.
That's exactly right. And so I think what Paul's doing with these household codes is he's like, look, so this is what you have to live within. Let's do it the Jesus way. Yeah. And of course, if you want to push against, I think if you look at any womanist theologians, any Black scholars on this, they make a really good point that if you are going to implement the male authority against women in those passages, you've got to implement the ones masters and slaves. And we know that we can't read, the slaves, that goes against everything else in the gospel. And so it's like, why are we putting a literal reading on women, but we're not doing a literal reading on slaves? If you think some of the early 20th century folk, like they've been in the news a lot lately, these slaveholders, there's a reason they use the household codes. They use them because they supported the system of oppression when they used them in the way that centered on male authority. And that is anti the gospel. Okay,
so as we kind of come to the close of our time here, here's my dilemma. And this has been my dilemma on this topic since I was a seminary student 20 plus years ago. It feels to me like there's enough data points in the New Testament that you can construct a very good argument for women having leadership roles in the early church movement, going all the way back to the first proclamation of Jesus' resurrection coming from Mary, right? It's there. Yeah. You can piece, and you do a good job of that in the book. However, there's also enough data points and enough ambiguity in some of these passages that if you want to build a case for complementarianism or patriarchy, you could probably do that too. Likewise, throughout church history, you've pointed out that there have always been women involved in ministry and leadership roles, and there have always been efforts to keep women out of those roles in various ways. So there's enough ambiguity in all these pieces to make me think, ultimately, we're going to pick what we want to be true and construct the argument that we want there to be patriarchy or egalitarianism. Is there a way out of that? Can somebody have a definitive answer on this, or are we just going to have to live in this ambiguity?
I think we always have to live in ambiguity, and that doesn't really bother me. What I was trying to do with this book, and I do think that history can push the conversation forward, because one of the things that I think history does, and what I tried to do in the book, was show how similar this Christian system of male headship and female submission, how this is not anything different than anyone else in non-Christian cultures were doing throughout history, as well as Christian systems that are radically different from Protestantism or very different from Protestantism. And so the question is why, when we have so many different cultures, we have so many different interpretations of theology, how come the constant is this male headship and female submission? Of course, the answer of complementarians is that it's written into the stars. This is what God always intended things to be. The problem with that is that it doesn't work well for women. This is a system that is inherently dangerous for women when it's pushed. I mean, it doesn't mean that everyone in it is an abuser, but it certainly amplifies abuse. And it's a system that has never worked well for women. It also has never worked well for the message of the Bible, in which, as I said, over and over again, we see God speaking for the oppressed. We see God overturning the systems. We see Jesus sitting and talking with women that he shouldn't be talking to. Jesus ignoring the voices of male disciples to listen to the voices of women. I mean, everything in the Bible tells us that Jesus is pointing us to a better world. So do we want to look like the way the world has always done this and the way the world has always oppressed people? Or do we want to look like the better world that Jesus is calling us to? And I don't think we're ever going to get there, but I don't see any reason to try to look for that better world. I'm an optimist. And so I think that's what I always want to push people towards. At the same time, if you read my book and say, well, that's all good and fine, but I think I'm still complementarian, I don't really care that much. It's as long as you realize that it is not gospel truth. That's what I was really going at, that you can be a faithful Christian and believe that God calls women to preach. You have not gone down the slippery slope that leads to heresy and rejecting the Christian faith. And that's the element that complementarianism has added to patriarchy. And that was really what I was going after. I wanted to disentangle those things. You can believe it, but it's not gospel.
Which came through loud and clear in the book. One of the things I appreciated that you did is so many complementarian voices these days argue that egalitarians are simply going along with the culture, right? The feminist movement of the culture is what's right. And you flip that argument saying, no, actually, it's the complementarians who are going along with what has dominated culture for most of human history. And you're the ones who are refusing to look at it. It's kind of that so much of evangelicalism defines itself by its enemies. And almost, we cut off our nose to spite our face. It's a sense, well, if my enemy believes in the equality of women, then I'm not going to. And
you hit it. Yeah, you're exactly right. That's what.
It's kind of silly. Okay, so before we completely wrap up, I'd love for you to stick around for a bonus segment because I really want to talk about Bible translation and how
I can do that.
Some modern translations have mistranslated the Bible quite deliberately in order to emphasize patriarchy and the whole controversy over gender inclusive language, that kind of thing. But to wrap up, I got to quote you from your book, quoting Beth Moore, because I think she has this wonderful plea, as she puts it, that I think we should all hear. Beth Moore says, quote, "What I plead for is to grapple with the entire text from Matthew 1 through Revelation 22 on every matter concerning women. To grapple with Paul's words in 1 Timothy and 1 Corinthians 14 as authoritative and God-breathed, alongside other words Paul wrote, equally inspired, and make sense of the many women he served alongside. Above all else, we must search the attitudes of Christ Jesus himself toward women."
Yeah.
For me, that's what it comes down to, is that the broad witness of the New Testament needs to be considered when diving into these specific texts. And for me, you mentioned all the things that patriarchy does to women, and not that we should turn a blind eye to that, but my biggest concern in all this is what patriarchy does to the church.
Yes.
In that,
I agree.
When I look at 1 Corinthians 12 or Romans 12, where Paul talks about the gifts of the Spirit given to the church for the edification of the church, and that each person should use those gifts in proportion to their faith, he never qualifies any of those gifts with gender.
Right.
And if there is a person, I don't care what their gender is, who's been given a gift for the edification and building up of the church, and we don't allow that person to use it in proportion to their faith, we're harming the church. And that's, for me, what tipped everything when I was studying this in the direction of, if a woman is gifted and mature in her faith, by all means, let her exercise that gift for the benefit of others, so that the whole church might be grown and glorify God.
That's exactly right.
Beth, thank you so much for writing this book. If you guys have not seen it yet, it's called The Making of Biblical Womanhood. how the subjugation of women became gospel truth. And I would also encourage you, if you have a strong point of view on this and it is more conservative, more patriarchal, more complementarian, read it anyway. You may strengthen your own arguments, but I think, Beth, you're right. At least you might come away realizing that people holding the other view are not heretics.
Right.
It's a well-researched, wonderful book, but you're going to stick around, and for our Patreon subscribers, you're going to get some extra conversation from Beth about Bible translations that will probably blow your mind. So, Beth, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
The Holy Post Podcast is a production of Phil Vischer Enterprises, that's Phil's company, and Skye Pilot Media, that's Skye's company. Production assistance by Julie Betcher. Editing by Jason Rugg. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by supporting us at patreon.com/holypost. Also, be sure to leave a review on iTunes so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary plus ukulele and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, and more.